Elizabeth Harper pressed her dead sister's last letter against her chest so hard the paper crinkled. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from the heat, not from the dust rising off the Montana road, but because she had just read the words her sister wrote the night before she died. Liz, don't come here. He doesn't take wives. He takes prisoners. And the wagon was still moving, still carrying her forward, toward him. If this story already has your heart, hit subscribe and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now stay with me because this is only the beginning. The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times, the creases had gone soft, the ink bleeding faintly at the corners, where Elizabeth's fingers always found the words first. Don't come here, Liz. Whatever Mama says, whatever he offers. Don't come. Clara had written those words 11 weeks ago. Clara was dead 8 weeks ago, and Elizabeth was still going. The wagon hit a rut in the road, and she grabbed the wooden seat with both hands, the letter tucking itself against her palm like it belonged there. Outside, the Montana summer was relentless, the kind of heat that didn't announce itself. It simply arrived and refused to leave, pressing down on the land until the grass turned gold and the creek beds showed their teeth. She could see the valley through the gaps between the canvas flaps. Rolling brown hills, scattered pine on the ridgelines, a hawk turning slow circles over something dead below. She hadn't slept in 2 days. The wagon driver, a thin man named Cobb who smelled like pipe tobacco and old leather, hadn't spoken more than 11 words since they left Harlan Junction that morning. She'd counted. She had needed something to count. How much farther? She asked. Cobb shifted his weight on the bench above. Hour, maybe less. And Black Ridge, is it a real town? A pause. She heard him spit. It's got a saloon and a church, Miss Harper. Whether that makes it real depends on the day. She almost laughed. Almost. She pressed the letter flat against her knee and read it again, even though she'd memorized every word weeks ago, even though the reading of it now felt less like remembering her sister and more like pressing on a bruise to make certain it still hurt. He showed me the deed to Papa's store last week. Said it has his name on it now. I don't know how. I don't know when Papa signed it. Maybe he didn't. Maybe that doesn't matter here. Liz, there are things in this valley that don't work like they should. The sheriff has Nathaniel's initials on his watch chain. The judge eats supper at his table every Friday. I tried to tell Mrs. Albright what I saw in his ledger, and the next morning her window was broken and her cat was gone. I'm telling you so you understand, this isn't a place where the truth protects you. Don't come here. I love you. Clara. Elizabeth folded the letter, tucked it inside her dress against her ribs. She'd come anyway, not because she wanted to, not because she'd run out of choices, though she had. She'd come because 3 weeks after Clara's funeral, Nathaniel Graves had appeared at their front door in Harlan Junction with 2 men behind him and a leather folder under his arm, and he'd sat across from her mother at the kitchen table and laid out the debt like he was reading from scripture. The store, the house, the small parcel of land her father had left them. All of it carrying his name, now documented, signed, witnessed, legal in the way only money could make things legal. Her mother had wept. Her mother had said, "He's offering to forgive it all, Liz, all of it. He just wants—" "I know what he wants," Elizabeth had said, and she'd looked at Nathaniel Graves across the table and she'd thought, "This is the man my sister warned me about. This is the man my sister died in a house belonging to. And my mother is asking me to go back to that house and call myself his wife." Nathaniel had watched her with the kind of patience that didn't come from kindness. It came from certainty. The patience of a man who already knew how the story ended. "Take your time," he'd said, and smiled. She'd had 4 days. 4 days to find another answer, and there wasn't one. Their lawyer was Nathaniel's cousin. Their bank held a mortgage that now had Nathaniel's signature as guarantor. The man had built a cage around their lives so slowly and so carefully that they hadn't seen the bars until the door was already swinging shut. So she'd packed her small valise. She'd kissed her mother's cheek. She'd walked out to Cobb's wagon on a Tuesday morning when the sky was white with heat, and she'd climbed up into the back, and she hadn't looked at the house as they drove away, because she knew if she did, she would lose the only thing she had left. Her nerve. The wagon slowed. She heard Cobb say something low, and then the sound of another horse. No two horses coming up fast on the road behind them. The wheels ground to a stop. "Miss Harper." Cobb's voice had changed. Dropped. "Don't make any sudden movements." She parted the canvas flap and looked back. Two riders, broad-brimmed hats pulled low against the sun, bandanas up over their faces. They'd come out of the brush on the eastern slope, and they were moving at a canter, not a gallop. Deliberate, unhurried, the way men moved when they didn't expect resistance. The taller one raised a hand. "Wagon stops." Cobb had already pulled the brake. Elizabeth let the canvas fall. Her heart was hammering. She pressed herself against the wagon's side and tried to think. The letter. That's what they wanted. She understood it instantly, the way you understood a thing your body knew before your mind did. Clara had written about the ledger, about the things she'd seen, and someone had sent Elizabeth a package 2 days before she left Harlan Junction wrapped in brown paper, no name on the outside. She'd opened it alone in her room and found a small leather journal, worn at the corners, the pages dense with names and numbers and dates, in a handwriting she didn't recognize. She'd hidden it inside the false bottom of her valise beneath the floorboard her father had built into every piece of luggage he ever made. Always keep a secret pocket, Lizzie. A man can take your bag, but he can't take what he doesn't know is there. The riders were beside the wagon now. She heard one of them talking to Cobb low and even. She heard Cobb's voice go tight with the effort of sounding calm. "Just a woman. Heading to Black Ridge." "We know where she's heading." A pause. "Ma'am, we need you to step out." Elizabeth sat very still. "Ma'am?" She opened the canvas flap and climbed down from the wagon, her boots hitting the packed earth road, dust rising around her ankles. She straightened and looked at them. They were watching her with the kind of eyes that calculated rather than saw. "We were told you might be carrying some papers," the taller one said. "Letters, that sort of thing. Mr. Graves just wants to make sure you arrive safely, without any confusion." "I have a letter from my sister," she said. "Would you like to read it?" "She's dead. I'm sure he knows that." The man's jaw moved. "Hand over the bag, ma'am." "No." A silence fell that had weight to it, the kind that preceded bad decisions. She saw the taller rider exchange a look with the other one, and she knew with absolute clarity that the next few seconds were going to go badly, and she had approximately no way to stop them. Then something moved on the ridge to her left. A horse. Coming down the slope at an angle, picking its way through the brush, with the kind of calm that suggested both horse and rider had descended worse terrain. A dark bay, tall, moving easy. The man on its back sat straight in the saddle without any appearance of effort. Like the horse and the land were both simply doing what he asked of them and hadn't considered the alternative. He pulled up 20 yards back, just sat there. The two riders had gone still. The man on the ridge didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't announce himself. He just looked at the scene on the road with the kind of attention that made everything he looked at feel like it was being measured. "Something wrong with your wagon?" he called out. His voice carried without being raised. A low voice, Montana dry. The taller rider turned halfway in his saddle. "Private business friend. Move on." "Reckon I'll stay put." He wasn't asking permission. The rider's hand moved toward his hip. "I said, I heard you." The man on the ridge shifted his weight slightly, just slightly, and the bay moved a step forward without being asked, and something in that small motion stopped the rider's hand where it was. Two men stopping a woman's wagon on an empty road, asking for her bag. That's private business, is it? Silence. "I'm Wyatt Callahan," he said. "I run the high pasture for the Morrison spread. Been in this valley 11 years. Know every man in it. Don't know you." He paused. "You want to tell me whose men you are? I might have a different conversation. Or you can keep your faces covered, and I'll go ahead and draw the conclusion that presents itself." The two riders looked at each other. The taller one said something too low for Elizabeth to hear. Then he wheeled his horse and the other one followed, and they went back the way they'd come through the brush up the eastern slope and disappeared. Elizabeth stood in the road with dust settling around her boots, and her heart making itself known in her throat. The man Wyatt Callahan came down the rest of the slope and walked his horse up alongside the wagon. He looked at her from under the brim of his hat. The hat was brown, weathered, the kind of hat that had been places. He had dark hair, longer than was fashionable, jaw rough with a beard that wasn't kept short, but wasn't kept either. His eyes were dark and still, and they looked at her the same way he'd looked at the riders, like he was taking in information, not passing judgment. "You all right, ma'am?" "I'm fine," she said. It came out more certain than she felt. "Your hands are shaking." She looked down. They were. She closed them. "I said I'm fine." He nodded once, accepting that. Looked at Cobb. "Those two, they from Graves's outfit?" Cobb said nothing. He was staring at his reins. Wyatt looked back at her. "You're headed to Black Ridge." "I am." "To marry Nathaniel Graves." She met his eyes. "That's the arrangement." Something moved across his face. Not pity, not surprise. Something quieter and harder than either of those. He looked away for a moment at the ridge where the riders had gone, then back at her. "That's what they told you," he said. "Or what you chose. Mr. Callahan." "I'm not trying to pry," he said. "I'm asking because it matters." She didn't answer right away. The sun was pressing down on everything. A fly was circling near the wagon wheel. Somewhere up on the ridge, a bird was calling the same note over and over, patient and hopeless. "My family owes him a debt," she said finally. "The arrangement cancels it." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. "A woman ain't a payment for another man's debt," he said. It wasn't said loudly. It wasn't said with any particular heat. He said it the way you'd say something that was simply true. The sky is blue. Water runs downhill. A woman ain't a payment for another man's debt. Elizabeth felt something crack open in the center of her chest. Not dramatically. Not the way things cracked in the novels Clara used to read with gasping and sudden tears. Just a small, clean fracture in something that had been held too tightly for too long. She said, "That's a fine thing to believe. The rest of this valley doesn't seem to share the opinion." "The rest of this valley's been scared of Nathaniel Graves for going on 15 years, Wyatt said. "Being scared makes people call cowardice something else. Practicality. Common sense. The way things are." He looked at her steadily. "Doesn't make it right." Cobb shifted on the bench. "Miss Harper, we should—" "Give us a minute, Cobb." The old driver subsided. She studied Wyatt Callahan. 11 years in the valley, he'd said. He knew the land the way a man only knew land he'd chosen, not inherited. He sat a horse like it was where he'd been born. And he'd ridden down that slope and put himself between her and two men with covered faces, without being asked, without knowing her name, without anything to gain from it. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "Why did I stop what? Them, those men. You could have ridden past." He looked almost puzzled, like the question hadn't occurred to him as a real question. "Didn't seem right not to." She almost laughed again. This time it actually came, small and involuntary. That simple. Most things are when you let them be. She looked down at her valise. Inside it, through 2 layers of leather, was a journal full of names and numbers and dates. Inside her dress, against her ribs, was her dead sister's last letter. In the valley below was a man who thought he'd bought her and was waiting with the patience of a man who was accustomed to getting what he paid for. She looked back up at Wyatt Callahan. "Those men will report back to him," she said. "They'll tell him what happened on this road. He'll know someone interfered." "Expect so." "That puts you in a difficult position." Wyatt settled back slightly in the saddle. "Miss Harper, I live on a mountain. I work alone. I don't own anything. Nathaniel Graves wants, and I haven't attended a single one of his suppers in 11 years despite repeated invitations." A small pause. "I've been in a difficult position with that man since about 1870. One more incident ain't going to change the landscape considerably." "You're not afraid of him." I didn't say that. His eyes were direct, honest. Fear and action are different conversations. A man can be afraid and still do the thing that needs doing. Something about that, the plainness of it, the lack of any attempt to impress her, made her trust it in a way she hadn't trusted anything in weeks. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Not here on the road. Somewhere Cobb can't hear, and the ridge above us isn't watching." Wyatt looked at the ridgeline, looked back at her, gave a single slow nod. He brought her to his camp, not his cabin, which sat another 2 hours up into the high pasture, but a temporary camp he'd made in a cut in the hillside, where the rock provided shade, and the creek ran cold enough that the sound of it covered their voices. He made coffee without being asked, wordless and efficient, and when he handed her the cup, he sat across the small fire from her and waited. She told him about Clara. She told him about the debt, about Nathaniel's visit to their home in Harlan Junction, about the 4 days her mother had given her, as though freedom could be calculated down to a unit and handed back like change. She told him about the package that had arrived, the journal, the names and numbers inside it that she didn't fully understand, but understood enough: purchases made at false prices, land deeds transferred under duress, men paid to witness signatures that she suspected in some cases had been forged entirely. She pulled the journal from her valise and held it out. He took it without grabbing, turned the first few pages with the unhurried attention of a man who read carefully and in silence. He looked up. "Where did this come from?" "I don't know. It arrived 2 days before I left. No name." He turned a few more pages. She watched his face. It stayed quiet, but his eyes moved with a kind of growing recognition, the way eyes moved when they found something they'd suspected but never been able to confirm. "You know these names?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Some of them." He closed the journal carefully. "There's a man in here, Amos Riley. He sold his farm 18 months ago. Said he got a fair price, moved his family north." He paused. "His wife told mine it wasn't fair. Said the man who bought it showed Amos a document saying the land value had been assessed at half what they'd paid for it." Amos didn't understand the paperwork. He signed. Another pause. "My wife passed 2 years ago, but before she did, she told me she believed half the transfers Graves had made in this valley were done the same way." Elizabeth was very still. "And nobody did anything. Nobody could prove anything." Wyatt set the journal on his knee. Documents looked right. The judge had already ruled on 3 separate disputes in Graves's favor. People around here learned what learning it cost them to challenge that man. He looked at her directly. "Your sister. You said she died in his house 8 weeks ago. They called it an illness. Sudden. She was 22, and she'd never been sick a day in her life." She made herself hold his gaze. "I think she found something she wasn't supposed to find. I think that journal might be what she found." Wyatt said nothing for a moment. The creek ran. The fire popped once. "If that's true," he said, "then bringing this journal into Black Ridge with you is the most dangerous thing you could do." "I know. And you're still going." "I have to. If I don't arrive, he takes everything from my mother. If I do arrive—" She stopped. "I don't know yet what happens if I arrive, but at least I'm there. At least I can look for what Clara was trying to tell me." Wyatt Callahan looked at her across the small fire for a long moment. He had the quality of stillness she was starting to recognize as characteristic, not absence, not blankness, but the stillness of a man who thought before he spoke and meant what he said when he did. "You're not afraid," he said. Not accusatory, wondering. "I'm terrified," she said. "But I already told you fear and action are different conversations." She held his own words back to him steadily. Something shifted in his expression. Small, a slight warming in the stillness. He looked at the journal on his knee, looked at the fire, looked at her. "You shouldn't go into that valley alone," he said finally. "I don't have a choice about that either. You might?" He turned the journal over in his hands once. "Graves's men know my face now. Know I stopped what happened on the road. By the time you reach Black Ridge, He'll know it too. He set the journal back on the ground between them. I got a reason to ride to town anyway. Supply run was overdue. He said it like it was a minor administrative matter, like he was simply adjusting a schedule. She understood what he was offering. She understood that it was not a small thing. Mr. Callahan. Wyatt. Wyatt. She let out a slow breath. He'll make it dangerous for you. He'll try, Wyatt said simply. He stood up, checked the coffee pot without any appearance of urgency, and began to break down the camp with the calm efficiency of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. He worked with his back to her, giving her the privacy of the moment, the space to decide without being watched. She looked at the journal on the ground, looked at her valise, looked at the cut of the ridgeline against the hard, bright sky above. Somewhere in that valley was the man who had taken her sister's life and called it illness, who had taken her family's livelihood and called it debt, who had bought himself a bride and called it arrangement, who was right now sitting in his house with the patience of a man who had never once been made to account for anything. She reached down and picked up the journal, tucked it back beneath the false bottom of her valise. Then she stood up and began helping Wyatt break camp. He glanced over his shoulder at her, said nothing, but the slight, almost imperceptible shift in his posture said enough. They were going to town together, and Nathaniel Graves was going to sit in his house and wait. And this time the thing he was waiting for was not going to be what he expected. They rode into Black Ridge at mid-afternoon side by side, saying nothing. Elizabeth kept her valise on her lap. Wyatt kept his eyes on the street ahead. The town wasn't large, one main road, storefronts on both sides, a saloon at the far end with horses tied out front. But the moment they rode in, she felt it. The way heads turned. The way conversations stopped. The way two men sitting outside the general store straightened up and watched with the specific attention of men who were paid to notice things. Word traveled fast in a valley owned by one man. "Don't look at them," Wyatt said quietly. "Look straight ahead." "I wasn't going to. You were thinking about it." She wasn't going to argue that point. He brought them to a stop in front of the livery at the near end of town, and climbed down without ceremony, looping his reins over the post with the ease of 10,000 repetitions. She climbed down herself before he could come around to offer a hand, and he registered that without comment, just a slight adjustment, stepping back to give her room. A boy of about 14 came out of the livery, stopping short when he saw Wyatt. "Mr. Callahan." Then his eyes went to Elizabeth, and his expression did the complicated thing young faces did when they were trying to work out what a situation meant. "Afternoon, Denny," Wyatt said. "She needs water and an hour's rest." He meant the horse. "Yes, sir." Denny took the reins but kept his eyes moving between them in a way that was too careful for a 14-year-old. He leaned closer to Wyatt, dropped his voice. "Mr. Callahan, there's been men asking around this morning about a woman coming in from Harlan Junction." Wyatt said, "How many men?" "3. Sheriff Holt was with them." Elizabeth stood very still. Wyatt nodded once slow. "Obliged, Denny." He handed the boy a coin without making a show of it. Then he turned to Elizabeth and said simply, "We need to not be standing in the open." He walked. She walked beside him. They went to the general store, not because they needed anything from it, she understood, but because it was the only building with 2 exits and a clear line of sight to the street. The owner, a stout woman in her 50s with flour on her apron, and the watchful eyes of a woman who had survived a long time in a complicated place, looked up when they came in. She looked at Wyatt. She looked at Elizabeth. She looked at the valise. "Martha," Wyatt said. "Wyatt." Her voice was neutral and careful, the voice of someone balancing a great deal of weight. "I heard you were coming to town." "You heard that in the last 2 hours." "I heard it about 45 minutes ago from one of Graves's men who stopped in for tobacco and mentioned it like it was gossip." She turned and started rearranging things on a shelf behind her that didn't need rearranging. "He also mentioned that you'd interfered on the North Road." "I introduced myself," Wyatt said. "That's not interference." Martha made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She turned back around and looked at Elizabeth with an assessment that was frank and not unkind. "You're the Harper girl." "Elizabeth Harper," she said. "Yes." "Clara was your sister." "She was." Something moved through Martha's face. Something with regret in it, and something else underneath guilt maybe, or its cousin. The feeling of having known something was wrong and having said nothing about it. "She was a sweet girl," Martha said, quietly. "She came in here twice a week. Always asked how my granddaughter was doing." A pause. "She asked me once about 2 months before she died if I knew anyone she could trust to send a letter to. Someone outside the valley. Someone Nathaniel's men wouldn't intercept." Elizabeth's breath shortened. "What did you tell her?" Martha's eyes went to Wyatt. He nodded. "I told her I didn't know anyone," Martha said. She held Elizabeth's gaze. "I was afraid. I'm not proud of it. But I was afraid." "Did she find someone else?" "I don't know." She paused. "But 2 days before she died, she came in here, and she bought 2 sheets of paper and an envelope, and she paid with the last coin she had in her pocket, and she looked at me and said, 'Mrs. Aldridge, if something happens to me, I hope someone in this town is brave enough to tell the truth.'" Martha's jaw tightened. "And then she walked out, and I didn't see her again." The store was very quiet. Elizabeth thought about the journal in her valise wrapped in the false bottom her father had built. She thought about how it had arrived with no name on the outside. She thought about the handwriting inside that she hadn't recognized. Clara had found someone to trust, and that someone had sent the journal to Elizabeth, which meant there was someone in this valley, someone close enough to Nathaniel Graves to get their hands on his private ledger, who had decided to stop being afraid. She didn't say any of this out loud, but she filed it carefully the way you filed something you would need to find again quickly in the dark. The bell above the store door rang. All 3 of them turned. The man who came in wore a badge on his chest and an expression on his face that had been arranged into something approximating friendliness, but didn't quite make it. He was broad, sandy-haired, wearing a decent coat in the summer heat, which meant he was trying to make an impression on someone. "Wyatt Callahan," he said like the name was a mildly interesting fact. "Didn't expect to see you in town." "Sheriff Holt." Wyatt's voice was even. "Supply run." Holt's eyes went to Elizabeth, and the arranged friendliness tightened slightly. "Miss Harper, Nathaniel told us to expect you this morning. He was concerned when you didn't arrive on schedule." He paused, letting the concern sit there like it was genuine. Mentioned there might have been some trouble on the road. "There was," Elizabeth said. 2 men stopped the wagon. They had their faces covered. Holt looked at her steadily. "That's a serious claim. Can you describe them?" "They were wearing bandanas," she said, "and they were on horses owned by Nathaniel Graves." A silence. "That's a significant accusation," Holt said. His voice hadn't changed temperature. "What makes you say they were Graves's horses?" "Because one of them was a tall black with a white stocking on the left foreleg and an NG brand on the right hip," Wyatt said pleasantly. "Which is the same brand on the 14 horses Nathaniel Graves keeps in his south pasture. I've ridden past them enough times to know the stock." Holt looked at Wyatt. A long look. "You were on the road." "I was in the area," Wyatt said. "Graves's men say a man interfered with legitimate business. Graves's men had their faces covered on a public road and were demanding a woman hand over her private belongings," Wyatt said. "If that's legitimate business in this county, I'd like to see the ordinance that makes it so." The sheriff's arranged expression was working harder now. "Wyatt, Sheriff." Wyatt's voice dropped 1 register. Still even. Still quiet. But something in it shifted the way bedrock shifted invisibly, and then all at once. "I've lived in this valley 11 years. I know what's legal and what isn't. I know what Nathaniel Graves's business looks like when it's conducted in the open versus when it's conducted with bandanas over faces." He paused. "You want to have a conversation about what happened on the North Road? I'm happy to have it. You want to write down what I just told you about those horses? I'll wait while you do." Holt did not write anything down. He looked at Elizabeth. "Mr. Graves is expecting you for supper." "I'll need a room at the boarding house first," she said, "to clean up and rest." "He's prepared a room at the ranch." "A room at the boarding house," she repeated. "Mrs. Calloway still runs it, I assume." Holt's jaw flexed. "She does. Then I'll stay there tonight." She said it without anger, without apology, without any indication that it was negotiable. "Please let Mr. Graves know I'll call on him in the morning." Another silence. This one had more weight than the last. Holt looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked back at him with the expression of a man watching something entirely ordinary take place. "Fine," Holt said. He touched his hat brim to Elizabeth, a gesture so automatic she doubted it was sincere, and went back out through the door. The bell rang once. Gone. Martha let out a long breath. "My lord," she said quietly. Elizabeth looked at Wyatt. "You all right?" he asked. "He's going straight to Graves," she said. "Yes." "Which means Graves knows I'm here. I'm not at his house, and you're the reason." "All accurate." "And you're not concerned." Wyatt tilted his head slightly. "Miss Harper, I've been not concerned about Nathaniel Graves's opinion of me for going on 11 years. I don't expect tonight's going to change that pattern considerably." Martha made the sound that was almost a laugh again. This time it was a little more laugh than it wasn't. The boarding house was 3 doors down, and Mrs. Calloway, a narrow woman of 60, with silver hair, and the bearing of someone who had decided long ago that she would not be diminished by the things life sent at her, took one look at Elizabeth and said, "I heard you were coming. I kept the corner room. It locks from the inside with a bolt that I installed myself, and the window has a drop to the alley that a woman of reasonable fitness can make without injury." She said this matter-of-factly, as though it were a standard feature of the accommodations. "Supper at 6. I don't tolerate guests of Mr. Graves coming to the door after 8 in the evening. I've told him so twice, and the policy stands." Elizabeth said, "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway." "Don't thank me," the woman said. "Clara stayed in that room for 3 weeks after she first arrived. Before she stopped, straightened. The bolt works. That's what matters." Wyatt did not come up to the room. He went to the saloon, he told her, because the saloon was where information lived in a town like this, and he needed to know what was being said and by whom. She had wanted to object. She had managed not to. She sat in Clara's room. She couldn't not think of it that way, with the door bolted and the valise open on her lap, and she looked at the journal. She spread it open on the bed and went through it page by page, slowly and completely, this time without the road moving under her and her heart hammering and 2 strange men waiting outside. The names were everywhere. 40, maybe 50 different names spread across 3 years of entries. Some she didn't know. Some she did. She recognized 3 men from Harlan Junction, 2 of whom had been regular customers at her father's store. Beside each name was a property description, a date, an assessed value, and then 2 numbers, what the land had sold for and what the record would show it sold for. The difference between those 2 numbers was in every single case in Nathaniel Graves's favor. And at the back of the journal, in a different handwriting than the rest, cramped, hurried like something written quickly or with shaking hands, was a list of 7 names. 7 names with a single word beside each one. Witnesses. 7 people who had seen the original transactions. 7 people who could testify that the official numbers were wrong. She stared at that page for a long time. Then she heard it. Voices below the window. She went to it carefully, staying to the side, not putting herself in the frame. 2 men in the alley below. She recognized one of them, a heavy-set man she'd seen standing outside Graves's men's bunkhouse in the description Clara had written once in a letter. The other she didn't know. "She's got something," the first man was saying. "Holt says she didn't look scared. Woman who just got stopped on the road should look scared. Graves wants her at the house tonight." "She's not coming tonight. She told Holt tomorrow morning." A pause. "Then we go in tonight." "The Calloway woman's got that room locked up like a..." "There are other ways into a building besides the door," the second man said. She stepped back from the window. She crossed to the door. She checked the bolt. It was solid, heavy iron, the kind Mrs. Calloway had said she'd installed herself, and she believed it. But 2 men in the alley, and only 1 bolt, and a night ahead. She needed to move faster than she'd planned. She repacked the journal, everything back under the false bottom, everything buckled down tight. Then she unlocked the door and went downstairs, and she went to find Wyatt Callahan. He was in the saloon as promised, at a table near the back wall with a beer he hadn't touched and a card game he was losing on purpose. She knew he was losing on purpose because the men across from him were talking, loosened by the alcohol and the winning, saying things men said when they felt superior and comfortable. She slid into the empty chair beside him and didn't say anything, and he didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on his cards. 2 men, she said quietly under the noise of the room. In the alley below the boarding house. They said there are other ways into a building besides the door. Wyatt put down a card. The men across from him whooped softly. "How long ago?" he said, conversational. 10 minutes. He nodded like she'd told him something unimportant. "You bring the bag." "It's upstairs. I can't go back for it if you don't need to." He looked up from his cards just briefly, just long enough to meet her eyes. "I need you to trust me for about 20 minutes. She thought about all the reasons she shouldn't trust anyone in this town. She thought about Sheriff Holt and his arranged friendliness and the badge over his heart that was supposed to mean something and didn't. She thought about Martha Aldridge and the look on her face when she'd talked about Clara. She thought about Mrs. Calloway and a bolt she'd installed herself. She said 20 minutes. Wyatt folded his cards, made a mild apologetic sound to the men across from him, and stood up. He walked out of the saloon unhurried, and she followed, and on the boardwalk outside he turned east without looking at her, and walked in the direction of the livery. He said, still without looking at her, "The 2 men in the alley, what did they look like?" She described them. He listened. "The heavy-set one," he said. "That's Rue Connolly. He's been with Graves 6 years. He's not smart, but he follows orders like a dog follows a whistle." A pause. "The other one I don't know by your description. That means Graves brought in someone new. Someone from outside the valley. Someone he doesn't mind being seen with things that can't be explained later," Wyatt said. They'd reached the livery. He went in, spoke briefly with Denny, who looked nervous, and immediately went to saddle a horse. Wyatt came back. "There's someone I want you to meet. Now. Right now." He looked at her fully for the first time since she'd found him in the saloon, and his expression was the same as it had been on the ridge above the North Road, taking in information, calculating, deciding. "There's a man who has been wanting to have a conversation about Nathaniel Graves for about 2 years. A man who knows what's in that journal because he's the one who wrote the back pages." She stared at him. "The witness list. His name is Thomas Garrett. He was the land assessor for this county until Graves had him removed from the position 14 months ago. He lives on a small place east of town out of Graves's direct sight, and he has been waiting very patiently, very carefully for someone to come along with enough reason and enough nerve to use what he knows." She thought about the package arriving at her door in Harlan Junction with no name. She thought about the handwriting on the back pages, hurried and cramped. She thought about Clara finding someone to trust. "He sent me the journal," she said. "He did. He got it out of Graves's office on the same night your sister—" Wyatt stopped, set his jaw. "He got it out of Graves's office 2 months ago. He'd been waiting for the right person to send it to. He sent it to me," she said slowly. "A woman he'd never met. Going to marry the man who—" "He sent it to Clara's sister," Wyatt said, "because Clara told him before she died that you were the one person she knew who wouldn't fold under pressure." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite admiration, but sat somewhere between them, honest and unadorned. She told him you were the one person in her life who'd never once backed down from anything that mattered. Elizabeth stood very still for a moment. The evening was coming on, the heat lifting slightly, the shadows going long. Somewhere across town in a house she'd never seen, Nathaniel Graves was sitting at a supper table, set for 2, waiting. Her sister had told a stranger that she was brave. Her sister had been dead for 8 weeks and was still somehow standing beside her. "Take me to Thomas Garrett," she said. And Wyatt Callahan brought his horse out of the livery, and she swung up behind him without being asked, and they rode east out of Black Ridge as the sun touched the ridge to the west. And behind them, the town watched them go with the particular silence of people who were frightened and hoped and didn't dare do either one out loud. The ride to Garrett's place took 20 minutes that felt like 5. She held the back of Wyatt's saddle, rather than him maintaining the careful distance of strangers who were not quite strangers anymore, and thought about what she was going to say to the man who had trusted her before she'd given him any reason to. The farmhouse was small, and deliberately unassuming, the kind of place that worked hard not to be noticed. A single lamp in the window. A dog that lifted its head when they rode up, but didn't bark, a dog trained to silence, she thought. The door opened before they reached it. Thomas Garrett was not what she'd expected. He was perhaps 50 slight, with the careful hands of a man who had spent his life working with documents, and the careful eyes of a man who had spent the last 2 years looking over his shoulder. He looked at her like a man looks at the outcome of a bet he'd been afraid to make. "Miss Harper," he said. "Mr. Garrett." She stepped down, met his eyes. "You knew my sister." "I did." His voice was quiet. "She was the bravest person I met in 20 years in this county." He stepped back to let them in, including myself, which is not, I realize, high praise. The 3 of them sat at his kitchen table, and Thomas Garrett talked. He talked for over an hour. He talked about the land transactions, explained what the numbers meant, explained how Graves had structured the fraud, so that each individual piece looked almost legal, how you needed to see the whole pattern to understand what it was. He talked about the 7 witnesses whose names were on the back pages. 3 still in the valley, 4 who had moved away under what he believed was coercion, but who could be found. He talked about a federal land commissioner named Hargrove, who had been asking questions in the territory for the past year, a man outside Graves's reach, a man whose jurisdiction covered exactly this kind of crime. "If you can get this journal to Hargrove," Garrett said, "with supporting testimony from at least 3 of those witnesses, he has grounds to open a federal investigation. Graves can buy the local sheriff and the county judge. He cannot buy the federal government." A pause. "Or not easily, and federal scrutiny has a way of making men who thought they were untouchable discover otherwise." "How do we get to Hargrove?" Elizabeth asked. "He's in Billings. That's 3 days' ride." Garrett looked at Wyatt. "But there's a telegraph in the next county. If someone were to wire him tonight with a summary and a request for urgency." "Someone would have to leave town tonight," Wyatt said. "Without Graves's men seeing them go." "Yes." A pause. Outside, the dog made a soft sound, not a bark, just an acknowledgement of something moving in the dark. Wyatt said, "I can do that." Elizabeth turned to him. "If you leave, I'm here alone. You won't be alone." He nodded at Garrett. "And you'll be here rather than in the boarding house, which means Connolly and whoever Graves brought in will be watching the wrong building." He held her gaze. "One night. I wire Hargrove I ride back before morning. You stay with Garrett, you don't go back to town until I return. And my meeting with Graves tomorrow morning. You'll be an hour late," Wyatt said. "He'll be angry. He's accustomed to people who get afraid when he's angry." He paused. "You are not accustomed to being that kind of person." She stared at him. "How do you know that? You've known me for 6 hours." "Because you spent those 6 hours doing the same thing you're doing right now," he said, "thinking 3 moves ahead." Thomas Garrett made a small sound that might have been agreement. Elizabeth looked at the journal on the table between them. Looked at the list of 7 names on the back pages. Looked at the lamp throwing its small circle of light against all that surrounding dark. She thought about Nathaniel Graves in his house, certain patient accustomed to outcomes that favored him. She thought about Clara buying 2 sheets of paper with her last coin and saying, "I hope someone in this town is brave enough to tell the truth." "Go," she said to Wyatt. "Wire Hargrove. Come back before morning." He stood. At the door he turned. "Don't open the door to anyone until I knock 3 times, Pause, then twice, he said. Any other knock you don't answer. 3 and 2, she said. He looked at her for a moment in the lamplight, and the look held something she didn't have a name for yet. Something that was not about the journal, or the 7 witnesses, or the federal land commissioner in Billings. Something older than that, and quieter than that. The kind of look a person gave when they were surprised to find in the middle of a very serious situation that they were in the company of someone they were glad to be with. Then he put his hat on and walked out, and she heard his horse move away into the dark, and she sat across from Thomas Garrett at a small kitchen table with a journal full of evidence between them. And outside somewhere in Black Ridge, Nathaniel Graves was learning that the woman he'd sent for had not arrived at his table, and a mountain cowboy had something to do with why. He'll send more men tonight, she said. Yes, Garrett said. To the boarding house first. Yes. And when they don't find what they're looking for, they'll widen the search. Garrett nodded. He reached under the table and brought up a rifle that had been leaning against the underside of it and set it where they could both see it. I've been waiting 2 years to stop being afraid, he said. I'd like to start tonight if it's all the same to you. Elizabeth looked at him. Thought about Clara, who had sat somewhere in this county and told this man that her sister was the one person she knew who wouldn't fold. It is, she said, exactly the same. And they waited. The knock came at 2 in the morning, 3, then a pause, then 2. Elizabeth was already awake. She'd been awake for most of it, sitting across from Thomas Garrett at the kitchen table, the rifle between them, the lamp turned low so the light wouldn't bleed under the door, and advertise their presence to anyone moving through the dark outside. Garrett had talked some. She had listened. He'd told her about Clara, small things, the kind of things that didn't make it into letters, the way Clara had laughed at something he'd said once about the absurdity of county paperwork, the way she'd asked careful questions and listened to every answer like it mattered. Elizabeth had stored each detail the way she stored everything now. Quietly, without letting it break her open. Not yet. When the knock came, she was on her feet before the second set finished crossing the room, hand on the bolt. Wyatt, she said. Not a question. It's done, he said through the door. She opened it. He came in with the night air behind him, and road dust on his coat, and the particular quality of tiredness that came from riding hard with purpose, rather than from riding hard without one. He pulled off his hat, looked at her first, then at Garrett, then at the rifle on the table. Any trouble, he said. 2 riders came past about midnight, Garrett said. Slow, looking, they didn't stop. He paused. They'll be back. Not before morning. Wyatt pulled out a chair and sat down. He looked at Elizabeth. Hargrove got the wire. He's been working a case in the territory for 10 months, land fraud, multiple counties. He said what we have fits a pattern he's been building documentation on. He set his hat on the table. He's riding in. 4 days, maybe 5. Garrett sat forward. He's coming personally. He said if the witness list is what I described, he wants to be here himself. Wyatt looked at them both. He also said to tell you both of you to stay alive until he arrives. Elizabeth almost smiled. He has a sense of humor. He has a case he's been trying to build for the better part of a year, and he doesn't want it to fall apart because something happens to the 2 people holding the central evidence. He looked at the journal on the table. Nothing happens to that book. Nothing will, she said. A silence settled. Outside, the night was holding still the way nights did just before they started becoming morning. Garrett poured coffee that had been sitting on the stove long enough to be serious about it, and no one complained. Wyatt wrapped both hands around the cup and stared at the table for a moment. Then he said without looking up, Graves knows you're not at the boarding house. Elizabeth set her cup down. When did he find out? Connolly went in through the window around 10. Found the room empty. By the time I was wiring Hargrove, they were turning the town over. He looked up. He also knows I sent a wire. Telegraph operator told him inside 20 minutes. Man's got ears in every building in Black Ridge. A pause. He knows I rode east. He'll figure out where you went, Garrett said. His voice was steady, but his hands weren't. He'll figure it out by morning, Wyatt agreed. which means we have until morning. Elizabeth looked at the window. Still dark. Still a few hours left in the night, if they were lucky, less if they weren't. She thought about 5 days between now and when Hargrove arrived. 5 days was a long time to stay alive in a valley owned by a man who had just realized that the careful, patient, 11-year-long arrangement of his power was starting to have a crack in it. "He can't touch the journal if he doesn't know where it is," she said. "And he can't discredit the witnesses if he doesn't know which ones are going to talk." Garrett looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we don't hide," she said. "I'm thinking I go to that meeting tomorrow morning." Both men looked at her. "He's expecting a frightened woman who spent a night alone in a locked room," she said. "He's expecting someone he can still manage. Someone who hasn't yet made any move he can't counter." She held Wyatt's gaze. "If I don't show up, he comes looking. He tears this valley apart looking. People get hurt. The witnesses get scared. We lose 5 days trying to stay hidden, and we show up to Hargrove with half of what we started with." "And if you go to him," Wyatt said carefully, "he thinks he still has control of the situation. He thinks I'm still manageable." She pulled the journal toward her, held it for a moment. "The journal stays here, with Thomas. What I bring to that meeting is the list of witnesses memorized. Nothing he can take from me. And I bias the time we need for Hargrove to arrive." Wyatt was very still. "That's a dangerous room to walk into." "I know. He's not—" He stopped himself, chose different words. Nathaniel Graves has never in his life had a conversation where the other person had more information than he did. If he suspects for 1 second that you're— "Then I make sure he doesn't suspect," she said. "Elizabeth." Her name in his voice instead of Miss Harper. She registered it. She thought he did too. "I won't be in that room." "No," she said. "You won't." "If something goes wrong, then something goes wrong," she said. "But sitting in Thomas Garrett's kitchen for 5 days waiting for a federal commissioner is not a plan. It's hope dressed up as a plan." She set the journal down. "I'm going to that meeting. I'm going to let Nathaniel Graves think he's won. And you're going to spend the next 4 days finding every one of those 7 witnesses and making sure they're ready to talk when Hargrove arrives." The silence that followed was the kind that meant someone was working through an argument they knew they were going to lose. Garrett spoke first. "She's right," he said. "Graves holding a conversation with her is the one situation where he's not looking for us. If she's in his house, we're invisible." Wyatt looked at her for a long time. 3 and 2, he said finally. She frowned. "What?" "If you need me, if something changes. You find a way to get a message out, and you put 3 knocks and 2 in it somewhere. I'll know it's you, and I'll know it's real." Something in her chest did the fracturing thing again. Small. Clean. 3 and 2, she said. He nodded, picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking from it. "I hate this plan," he said. "I know." "It's a good plan," he said. "I still hate it." She didn't say anything. But she didn't look away from him either. The morning came the way mornings came when you hadn't slept gradually, and then all at once the dark going gray before she'd quite registered the shift. She washed her face with water from Garrett's basin, changed into the second dress she'd packed, did what she could with her hair. She looked in the small mirror above the washstand and told herself the things she needed to hear and made herself believe them. Garrett handed her the journal before she left. She looked at him. "I'm leaving it here with you." "No," he said. He pressed it into her hands. "You take it. If Graves's men come for me while you're in that house and they find this, everything ends." He held her gaze. "Take it. Keep it under that false bottom where Clara's father put it. It's safe there. It's been safe there this whole time." She looked at the journal, at Garrett's steady hands holding it out. "Thomas," she said, "you've been afraid for 2 years." "Yes," he said simply. "Are you still afraid?" He thought about it genuinely. "Yes," he said again. "But like Wyatt said, fear and action are different conversations." She took the journal. Wyatt walked her to the edge of town. They didn't speak much. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said, and neither of them were people who repeated things for the comfort of hearing them twice. At the point where the track from Garrett's place met the main road into Black Ridge, he stopped. She stopped beside him. He looked at the road, looked at her. "If he puts his hands on you," he said, "in any way that isn't the way a man greets a guest, you leave. You don't explain, you don't negotiate. You stand up and you walk out." "He won't," she said. "Not yet. He's still trying to look like the reasonable man in this story." "He's not a reasonable man. I know. But he needs people to think he is." She shifted the valise in her hand. "That's his weakness. He cares what the town thinks of him. He needs the performance to hold." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Your sister said the same thing about him," he said. Almost exactly the same words. It hit her the way those moments always hit, without warning, squarely in the center. She breathed through it. "Then Clara was right," she said, "and I'll trust her judgment on this the same way I'd trust it on anything." He took a step back. It was the step that said, "I won't follow you from here." It cost him something, she could see that. He didn't try to hide it, and he didn't make theater of it. It was just a man standing at the edge of a road, letting a woman walk into danger because she'd asked him to, and he respected her enough to do it. She walked. She didn't look back. But she heard him standing there until the road curved and took her out of his sight line, and somehow that was its own kind of company. Nathaniel Graves's house was the largest structure in the valley. She'd known that from Clara's letters, from Garrett's descriptions, from the way everyone in town seemed to orient themselves relative to it. The way you oriented yourself, relative to something that exerted gravity. She came to the gate at 9:30 an hour later than she'd told Holt she would be there, and the man who opened the gate looked at her with the expression of someone who had been told she might be difficult. She gave him her most uncomplicated smile. "I'm afraid the morning got ahead of me," she said pleasantly. "Is Mr. Graves expecting me?" The man led her through. The house was arranged the way powerful men arranged spaces to make other people feel small before a word was spoken. She walked through it without looking small. She looked at things with appropriate interest, as though she were a guest arriving for the first time with ordinary curiosity, as though she were exactly what Nathaniel Graves believed her to be, a woman with no options doing what women with no options did. He was in the front room when they brought her in. He stood when she entered, which surprised her. A tall man, well-dressed, older than she'd pictured somehow, despite knowing his age, not old, but carrying his years with the particular weight of a man who had spent them taking rather than building. He had a face that had learned to arrange itself into warmth on command, and he used that skill now, coming toward her with both hands out, and an expression of relief so carefully constructed she almost believed it. "Miss Harper." He took her hand. "I was worried." "I'm sorry to have concerned you," she said. "The road was more tiring than I anticipated." He held her hand a moment longer than a greeting required. "Testing." She let him, returning a mild smile that said nothing. "Come sit down," he said. "You must be hungry." They sat at a table that could have seated 12. He sat at the head. She sat where he indicated 2 seats down, which put distance between them, and also put her against the wall with a clear view of the door. She didn't think he'd arranged it that way for her benefit. He talked while they ate. He had a way of talking that filled every silence before it could become uncomfortable. A flow of words that sounded like conversation, but functioned like control. He asked questions, but before she could fully answer them, he'd move to the next, so that she was always slightly behind, always responding to where he'd been rather than where he was. She recognized it within the first 5 minutes. She'd met men who did this. They always thought they were the cleverest person in the room. She let him talk. She answered what he asked simply and pleasantly, giving him nothing that was real and nothing that was obviously withheld. She ate. She complimented the coffee. She asked a polite question about the history of the valley that got him started on a subject he clearly enjoyed, and gave her 3 full minutes of needing to do nothing but listen. The first test came early. he said casually between sentences about the valley's history and a bite of his breakfast. I understand you had some trouble on the road yesterday. A little, she said. 2 men stopped the wagon. I think they may have been outlaws of some kind. Outlaws. His eyes moved over her face. Did you recognize them? They had their faces covered, she said. I was frightened naturally, but a man who was passing by intervened and they rode off. Very fortunate. The man who intervened, he said. That would be Wyatt Callahan. She let a small expression of confirmation cross her face, as though acknowledging something he already knew was merely polite. He was in the area, yes. He was very gentlemanly. He saw me safely to town. Callahan is... Graves paused, choosing words. He's an independent sort, lives up on the ridge. Not always, shall we say, aligned with the interests of the community. He seemed perfectly decent to me, she said mildly. But I only spoke with him briefly. I'm sure you know him better than I do. She watched him decide whether to push. She watched him decide not to. He filed it instead, added it to whatever he was building in his mind about where she stood and what she knew, and moved on. I want to speak with you about the arrangement your family has agreed to, he said. His voice shifted, became something more direct. The performance of warmth stored for later. I want to be straightforward with you, Elizabeth. May I call you Elizabeth? Of course, she said. I want to be straightforward. I know this situation isn't what any young woman would choose for herself. I know coming here took courage. His eyes were steady on her, watching with that calculating patience. I want you to know that I intend to be generous. Your mother's debts are forgiven as agreed. I intend to provide well for you. This house, this valley, they're not small things. No, she said, they're not. What I need from you is cooperation, he said. That's all. Cooperation and discretion. I run a complex operation here, and there are aspects of it that are better kept within appropriate circles. He let that sit. Your sister struggled with that. She was a curious woman, curious in ways that weren't always... Another pause, choosing words again. Weren't always wise. She looked at him. She kept every muscle in her face in its place. Clara was very intelligent, she said. She always wanted to understand things. It was one of her qualities. She smiled, small and sad. I miss her very much. He watched her for a moment, then he nodded. Of course you do, he said. Of course. And she understood with absolute cold clarity that he was looking for grief and finding it, and that the grief was real, and that using it was the only thing she was doing that didn't feel like a performance. She let him see it because it was there, and because it cost her to show it, and the cost of it made it look like the only real thing on the table, which meant he stopped looking for what else might be real. They talked for another hour. She asked careful questions about the valley, about how the ranching operations worked, about the community questions any newly arrived woman might ask, nothing that approached the territory of land deeds or county assessors or federal jurisdiction. He relaxed by degrees. Not fully, he was not a man who fully relaxed, but enough that the calculating quality in his eyes shifted from active suspicion to something more like satisfaction. He thought he was managing her. She let him think it. When she rose to leave, he stood again, walked her to the door, made the appropriate sounds about looking forward to further conversations, set a date for dinner later that week. She accepted with appropriate warmth. She walked down the porch steps with her valise in her hand and her heart beating in her ears. She was 20 yards from the gate when she heard him. Miss Harper. She turned. He was standing on the porch, looking at her with an expression that had shifted, the warmth gone, something else underneath it now, something that had been there the whole time waiting. Your sister wrote letters, he said. It wasn't a question. Toward the end. I'd very much like to know if she sent any to you. Her hands were completely still at her sides. She wrote, Elizabeth said. Sisters do. Mostly news about the valley. Recipes, that sort of thing. She held his gaze without effort. She wrote that she was happy. I was glad to hear it. The pause that followed was the length of a held breath. Of course, he said, and smiled, and went inside. She walked through the gate and did not change her pace until she was past the first bend in the road and out of his sight line. Then she stopped and pressed her hand against her ribs, against the hard edge of the valise, against the leather journal inside it, and took 3 long breaths. He knew. He didn't know what she had. He didn't know about Garrett or the witnesses or the wire to Hargrove. But he knew she was not what she was pretending to be. And he knew it the way clever men knew things, not from evidence, but from instinct. The instinct of a predator who had learned to read the difference between genuine surrender and something that looked like it. She had bought time. She didn't know how much. She found Wyatt at Martha Aldridge's store, which they'd agreed on that morning as the safest meeting point in town, public enough that nothing could happen inside it, familiar enough to both of them to seem unremarkable. He was standing at the counter pretending to examine a length of rope when she came in. He looked at her face and immediately set the rope down. Martha looked at them both and moved to the far end of the store. "He knows I'm not what I said I was," Elizabeth said quietly. "Not specifically, but he's suspicious." He asked about Clara's letters. Wyatt's jaw tightened. "What did you tell him?" "That she wrote about recipes and the valley and said she was happy." She set her valise on the counter between them. "He's going to test it. He's going to send someone to Harlan Junction to ask my mother what letters she received from Clara." She paused. "My mother won't lie well. She never could." How long before he gets an answer back? 2 days if he sends a rider now, 1 day if he uses the telegraph. She looked at him. "When is Hargrove arriving?" 4 days, maybe 5. Then we have 1 day before Graves knows I'm not telling the truth, and 4 days after that before Hargrove arrives. She held his gaze. 3 days with Graves knowing I'm lying and nothing he can do about it without revealing his own hand. "Unless he decides to do something about it regardless," Wyatt said. "He won't, not openly. He's spent 15 years building the appearance of a legitimate man. He won't risk that unless he's certain he has no other option." She kept her voice low and even. "But after 1 day we can't count on his restraint." Wyatt looked at the valise. He looked at her. "Thomas has started," he said. "He went to the first 2 witnesses this morning. Amos Riley's cousin is still in the valley. He was on the list. He's agreed to talk." A pause. "The widow Pierce said yes inside 2 minutes. Said she'd been waiting for someone to ask." 3 witnesses, Elizabeth said. "We need at least 3 for Hargrove." "We'll have them," Wyatt said. Something in his voice was different from how it had been that morning at the edge of the road. More settled. More certain. Like a man who'd spent a night being afraid of a thing, and had decided somewhere in the riding and the wiring and the waiting that the fear was real, but so was everything on the other side of it. "I'll have the 3rd one by nightfall." She believed him. She didn't examine the fact that she believed him. She just took it and put it with the other things she was carrying. Martha came back down the length of the store. She looked at Elizabeth with the expression she'd worn the day before, the one with regret in it, and what lived under regret. She reached under the counter and brought out an envelope. "This came for you this morning," she said. "A boy brought it. Didn't say who sent it." Elizabeth looked at the envelope. Her name on the outside in handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 3 words. "He found it." She turned it over. Nothing on the back. She looked at Martha. "The boy who brought this, what did he look like?" "Young. Maybe 10. Dark-haired." Martha paused. "He said a woman gave it to him by the creek. A woman with red hair." Elizabeth looked at Wyatt. He was already reading the 3 words over her shoulder. She watched his face. "There are 3 women with red hair in this valley," he said slowly. "One works for Graves." "Then it's not her," Elizabeth said. "What about the other 2? One is 70 years old. The other—" He stopped. His expression changed. "The other is Dora Riley, Amos Riley's wife. The same Amos Riley whose cousin was on the witness list. The same Amos Riley whose wife had told Wyatt's wife that the land sale wasn't fair." Elizabeth looked at the paper again. He found it. "What did he find?" she said. Wyatt was quiet for 1 second. 2. Clara hid something, he said. Besides the journal. Before she died, she hid something else, and Graves has been looking for it for 2 months, and now he's found it. She stared at him. How do you know that? Because Dora Riley's husband told Thomas Garrett 3 days ago that Graves had his men tearing apart the room where Clara lived for the past 6 weeks, he said. And Garrett didn't tell me until this morning because he didn't know if it was relevant. He held her gaze. And because Clara wrote to you about recipes. Elizabeth went still. You said Graves asked about her letters, Wyatt said. He asked specifically. Not did she write. He asked if she sent letters to you. Plural, not a letter. He paused. He's not looking for the journal. He knows the journal is gone. He probably figured that out when Garrett disappeared from his position. He's looking for something else. Something else Clara found or made or hid. He looked at her with an expression that was completely focused. What was in those letters, Elizabeth? Not what you told him. What was actually in them? She thought about the letters. Clara's handwriting round and careful. The valley news, the weather, the small details of daily life that she'd read and reread in the months before Clara died. The pressed flower that had fallen out of one envelope. The question Clara had asked once about whether their mother still kept the old recipe tin. She stopped breathing. Recipes, she said. She wasn't writing about recipes. She looked at Wyatt. Her voice had gone absolutely even. She was telling me where she hid something. The recipe tin. Elizabeth said it out loud, quietly testing the shape of it. She asked me in October whether Mama still kept the old recipe tin. The one Papa made. It had a false bottom the same way his luggage did. He built that into everything. Wyatt was watching her. She wasn't asking about a recipe tin, Elizabeth said. She was telling me there was one here. She built one. Or she found one. Or she stopped. Clara was clever with her hands. Papa taught us both. She could have made something like that out of anything. And Graves found it, Martha said from the end of the counter. Both of them had forgotten she was there. She didn't apologize for listening. Whatever was inside it. He found it this morning, Wyatt said. Which means whatever advantage it gave him, he's had it for maybe 4 hours. Elizabeth was already moving. She picked up her valise and headed for the door. Wyatt caught up in 2 strides. Where are you going? To find Dora Riley, she said. She sent that note. She knows more than 3 words. He didn't argue. They went out together into the summer heat of Black Ridge's main street, and Elizabeth walked like a woman who knew exactly where she was going and had been going there for some time. She had no idea where Dora Riley lived. She didn't break stride. Left at the end of the street, Wyatt said quietly beside her. Small house behind the feed store, green door. You know everyone in this valley. 11 years, he said. You learn the doors. The green door opened before they knocked. Dora Riley was perhaps 35, red-haired as promised, with the look of a woman who had made several hard decisions in the last 24 hours and was managing the aftermath. She stepped back and let them in without a word, checked the street behind them, closed the door. I sent the note as soon as I heard, she said. My husband's cousin came to the house this morning. He'd been to see Thomas Garrett, and he told Amos, and Amos told me. She looked at Elizabeth directly. I knew your sister. I know, Elizabeth said. Dora blinked. She told you about me? She told me there were good people in this valley, Elizabeth said. She didn't always name them, but the way she wrote about certain things I could tell. She held the woman's gaze. What did Graves find? Dora sat down, put her hands flat on the table in front of her, like she needed to feel something solid. Clara came to me 6 weeks before she died, she said. She'd found something in Graves's study. Not the ledger, she'd already gotten the ledger to Garrett by then. Something else. She called it the correspondence. Letters, Wyatt said. Letters between Graves and Judge Alderman, Dora said. And between Graves and 2 men in the territorial government. Going back 8 years. Letters that showed. She stopped. pressed her hands harder against the table. Letters that showed they'd been coordinating, that the land fraud was bigger than just this valley, that there were men in positions of authority in this territory who knew exactly what Graves was doing and were paid to let it happen. Elizabeth sat down across from her. "That's not just a county matter," she said. "No," Dora said. That's why Clara was so frightened. She'd thought she was finding evidence against one corrupt rancher. She found evidence of a conspiracy that went up 2 levels above him. She looked between them. If those letters exist, and if Hargrove has jurisdiction over federal land matters, those letters change everything. They don't just take down Graves, they take down the men protecting him, Wyatt said. And Graves found them this morning. My husband's cousin heard Graves's man Connolly talking outside the hardware store. He'd had too much to drink, which is the only reason he said anything. Dora's jaw was set hard. He said Graves found what the Harper girl's sister had hid, and now everything was going to be fine. Silence. Elizabeth's mind was working fast and clean, the way it worked when things were clear, when the shape of a problem came into view. "He thinks he has everything," she said. "He has the correspondence. He thinks the journal is lost. He doesn't know about Hargrove's wire, and he thinks he has me managed." She looked at Wyatt. "He's going to move quickly now. He'll want everything tied off before anyone can use what they know." "The witnesses," Wyatt said. "He'll go after the witnesses," she said. "Not obviously, but quietly, the same way he does everything. A conversation here, a threat there. By the time Hargrove arrives, if Graves has 3 days and knows who the witnesses are—" "He doesn't know who they are," Wyatt said. "Only Garrett has that list." "Garrett's name is on that wire I sent," Wyatt said, and stopped, and she watched him understand the same thing she'd just understood. Hargrove wasn't the only one who'd gotten information from that wire. The telegraph operator had told Graves within 20 minutes. The telegraph operator knew Garrett's name. "We have to get to Thomas," she said. They were out the door before Dora could speak. They heard her behind them. "I'm coming too," and Elizabeth didn't slow down to tell her not to. The 3 of them moved fast through the back way. Wyatt knew behind the buildings, through the gap between the smithy and the old tannery, out along the creek path that ran east toward Garrett's place. Wyatt set the pace, and it was faster than comfortable. Elizabeth kept up without being asked. She was thinking about Clara the entire way. Clara had found the correspondence, had hidden it, had known it was bigger than either of them had imagined when she'd written those letters about recipe tins, had been sending Elizabeth the map to it quietly, carefully, in ordinary words that would mean nothing to anyone reading over her shoulder, had died before Elizabeth could come, and now Graves had it and thought he'd won and was wrong. But being wrong wasn't going to stop him from acting like he was right, and acting like he was right was going to hurt people. Garrett's farmhouse came into view, and Elizabeth knew before they reached it. The door was open. Not the way a door was open when someone had stepped out for a moment. Open the way a door was open when someone had left in a hurry, or not left by choice. Wyatt was already running. She ran. Inside the kitchen was overturned. Not destroyed, not ransacked in the way of men who were angry. Overturned in the way of men who were looking for something specific and hadn't found it, which was almost worse, because it meant they were methodical. And methodical men came back. The rifle was gone from the table. "Thomas?" Wyatt called. "Nothing. He went through the back room and came out in 3 seconds. He's not here." "Did they take him?" Dora said. "No sign of a struggle," Wyatt said. He was looking at the room the way he looked at everything reading it. "His coat's gone. His boots are gone. His horse is gone." He looked at Elizabeth. "He ran. He got out before they got here." "Where would he go?" Elizabeth said. Wyatt moved to the table. Something there, a small thing easy to miss if you weren't looking, a cup on its side with the handle pointing toward the window that faced north. The window toward the ridge. "He came to me," Wyatt said. "Or he's going to. He knows my place on the high pasture. He knows I'd be the one who—" He stopped. "He's heading up the mountain. How long would it take him?" "On horseback 2 hours at least. If he left within the last hour, he's still on the lower trail. Wyatt was already heading for the door. I need to get to him before Graves's men work out where he's gone. Go, Elizabeth said. He turned, looked at her. The look lasted 1 second and carried the weight of about 10 things neither of them had said. Take Dora. Go to Martha Aldridge's back room. Don't go to the boarding house. Don't go anywhere you've been before. He paused. 3 and 2. 3 and 2, she said. He went. Elizabeth turned to Dora. Dora was looking at the overturned kitchen with an expression that had moved past frightened into something harder and more useful. Martha Aldridge, Dora said. All right. You don't have to. I was friends with your sister, Dora said. Not loudly, not with drama, just a fact laid flat and honest on the air between them. I didn't do enough while she was alive. I'm doing something now. She looked at Elizabeth. Let's go. They went back by the creek path and came in through Martha's back door without knocking. Martha opened it before they reached it. She'd been watching. Of course she'd been watching. Garrett's place was searched, Elizabeth said. I heard, Martha said. Because this was a town where sound traveled and Martha Aldridge had lived in it for 30 years. She stood aside, let them in, locked the door behind them. They sat in Martha's back room, which smelled like flour and lamp oil, and the particular quiet of a room that had held secrets before. Dora's hands were still in her lap. Martha moved around making coffee she hadn't asked if they wanted the way women did when they needed to do something with their hands. Elizabeth put the valise on the table and opened it. She took out the journal, laid it flat. She thought about Clara's letters. October, the question about the recipe tin. November, a long description of learning to make biscuits from one of the ranch women, a description so detailed it had made Elizabeth smile and wonder why Clara was writing so much about food when she'd never cared much about cooking. December, a recipe for something called a miner's stew, with a list of ingredients so specific, so precisely ordered, so unlike any recipe Elizabeth had ever seen, that she'd read it twice and then set the letter aside thinking Clara had simply been bored. She hadn't been bored. Martha, Elizabeth said, do you have paper? Martha brought it without asking why. Elizabeth wrote from memory. Not the recipes, the structure beneath them. The specific words Clara had used. Phrases that had felt slightly wrong, slightly off in the way that things felt when they were trying to do 2 jobs at once. She wrote them in a column and looked at them. Dora leaned over, read them. What am I looking at? I don't know yet, Elizabeth said. But my sister was sending me information. She was hiding it in plain language because she knew her letters might be read. She looked at the column. She told me where she hid the correspondence. She thought I'd come and find it. A pause. She didn't know Graves would find it first. Maybe he didn't, Martha said. Both women looked at her. Martha was standing with the coffee pot looking at the column of words over Elizabeth's shoulder. She set the coffee pot down. Connolly said Graves found what the Harper girl's sister hid. She paused. Not the correspondence, not letters, just what she hid. She looked at Elizabeth. What if there was more than one hiding place? Elizabeth went very still. Clara was methodical, she said slowly. She was the most careful person I've ever known. She would have known that if Graves found one thing, she needed another. She looked at the column. The recipe tin. That was the first hiding place. The obvious one if you knew to look. She sent me the map to the correspondence because it wasn't with the recipe tin. Where is it? Dora said. Elizabeth read down her column of phrases. Past the October letter, past the November description of biscuits, to the December recipe, the miner's stew with the precisely specific list of ingredients. She read it again, and this time she read it like a message rather than a recipe, and this time it opened. The church, she said. She hid it in the church. Martha sucked in a breath. No one touches the church. Even Graves's men don't. That's why she chose it, Elizabeth said. He couldn't search it without the whole town knowing, without it becoming the act of a man who had no respect for anything decent. She looked up. She knew his weakness. She knew he needed the town's respect more than he needed anything else. She stood up. The correspondence is still there. He found the recipe tin, he found her decoy. He doesn't know about the church. You can't go to the church right now, Martha said. His men are watching every building on the main street. They'll follow you. Not me, Elizabeth said. She looked at Martha. You go every day. Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she set down the coffee pot, untied her apron, and said, Tell me where to look. Elizabeth described it as precisely as she could from the language of Clara's letter, from the things Clara would have had access to, and the places in a church that a woman could reach without drawing attention. A loose stone near the altar. A hollow in the woodwork beneath the second pew, from the front on the left side, where Clara had written about sitting and finding the wood oddly poorly joined. Martha listened, nodded once, put her apron back on as cover, and went out the front. Elizabeth and Dora waited. This was the hardest part. The waiting without being able to act, the sitting with the thing you couldn't see happening, and the things you could imagine happening instead. Elizabeth put her hands flat on the table, the way Dora had done at her kitchen, and felt the solid surface under her palms, and thought about Wyatt riding up the mountain toward Garrett, about Thomas on his horse with his coat and boots, and his 2 years of careful, frightened knowledge, about Hargrove somewhere in the territory riding toward them with jurisdiction in his pocket. She really talked about you, Dora said. Elizabeth looked up. Clara, she talked about you a lot. Dora's voice was quiet. She said, I remember this exactly because it struck me. She said, My sister has never once in her life walked away from something that mattered, even when walking away would have been easier. She's the bravest person I know, and she doesn't think she is, which makes her braver. Dora paused. I thought about that after she died, kept thinking about it, wondering if you'd ever come. Elizabeth looked at her hands on the table. I almost didn't, she said. I stood in my mother's kitchen for 4 days trying to find another answer. But you came. I came. Then Clara was right, Dora said simply. The back door opened, and they were both on their feet in an instant. Martha came in breathing slightly faster than usual, with the careful, deliberate face of someone who had been walking normally through a public space and was only now allowing themselves to feel what they felt. She set something on the table, a small package, oilskin carefully wrapped and tied, the kind of wrapping you used when you needed something to last. Third pew, Martha said. Not the second. Third left side under the kneeling board. She'd carved a small hollow in the wood. Neat work. Her voice was slightly unsteady. Neat, careful work. She must have done it over weeks. Elizabeth picked up the package. Her hands were steady. She didn't know how. She untied it. Inside were letters. 12 of them. She could see from the first one, from the handwriting and the letterhead, that Dora had been right. Nathaniel Graves to Judge Alderman. To a man named Forsyth in the Territorial Government Office. To someone who signed only with initials that she didn't recognize yet, but would learn. 8 years of correspondence. 8 years of coordinated land fraud across 4 counties, protected from above, documented below, hidden in a church by a 22-year-old woman who had understood that she was holding something bigger than her own survival and had hidden it anyway. Elizabeth held the letters and felt Clara so close and so gone that it was almost the same thing. We need to get these to Wyatt, she said. Her voice came out even. Tonight, before Graves realizes the recipe tin was the decoy. How long before he figures that out? Dora asked. When he reads what's in the tin and it's not the correspondence, Elizabeth said. He'll know Clara misdirected him. He'll know there's something else somewhere. She looked at Martha. How long can you hide 2 women and a package of letters in your back room? Long as necessary, Martha said without hesitation. I hid a runaway once for 6 days. Graves's men searched this building twice. She paused. I have a cellar. Dora said, How do we get word to Wyatt? Denny, Elizabeth said. The livery boy. 14 years old and already carefully not telling people things on Wyatt's behalf. He's Wyatt's ears in town. He'll know how to reach him on the mountain. Martha went to find Denny. Elizabeth sat with the letters in her hands and went through them. carefully, methodically, the way Clara would have. She built a picture as she read a shape that assembled itself from fragments the way all true things did not, all at once, not cleanly, but piece by piece, until you couldn't unsee it. Graves had started small. A single land transaction in 1873, documented falsely overlooked by a judge who had received a generous payment for his attention to other matters. Then another transaction. Then a pattern. Then a network, not just this valley, but 3 others. Not just one judge, but 2. Not just county level, but men with territorial authority, who had taken money to ensure that certain federal inquiries went nowhere, and certain land assessments came back favorable, and certain witnesses found it difficult to maintain their original accounts. Clara had found the center of it, and Clara had known that finding it and surviving it required keeping these letters away from the man who'd written them. And she'd done that, and she'd died anyway. And these letters had waited in a church pew for 8 weeks for someone to come and finish what she'd started. "I've got you," Elizabeth said. Not to anyone in the room, just to Clara quietly over the letters. "I've got it. I'm going to finish it." The door from the front of the store opened. Not Martha, not Denny. She knew before she looked up. She felt it in the quality of the silence that preceded it, the way air changed before something bad arrived. Rue Connolly stood in the doorway. He wasn't alone. He looked at Elizabeth, looked at the letters in her hands, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had just understood that the thing his employer thought he'd secured was still very much unsecured. "Miss Harper," he said, "Mr. Graves would like a word." She didn't put the letters down. She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Graves can wait until morning," she said. "As I told Sheriff Holt, I'll call on him." "He's not asking for morning," Connolly said. He stepped into the room. The man behind him stepped in too. "He's asking for now." Dora was on her feet. Connolly glanced at her once and dismissed her. That was his mistake. "This is Mrs. Aldridge's private property," Elizabeth said. Her voice was completely level. "And these are my private correspondence." She held the letters up. "If Mr. Graves wants to discuss them, he's welcome to do so in front of his neighbors on the main street of this town, where everyone can hear what he has to say about private letters belonging to a dead woman." Connolly's jaw tightened. "He's not going to—" "Or," Elizabeth said louder now, loud enough to carry through the thin wall to the storefront, loud enough for the main street beyond it. "If the wind was right, he can send his man into a widow's back room to put his hands on a woman in the middle of the day, and every person in this town can decide what that means about the kind of man he is." Silence. She saw it in Connolly's face, the same calculation she'd seen in Graves's. The same problem. The performance had to hold. The appearance of legitimacy was the entire structure. You couldn't be a respected man who ran a community while your hired hand roughed up women in a storeroom in broad daylight. Not yet. Not until he was certain the alternative was worse. "Tell your employer," Elizabeth said quietly, "that I will call on him first thing tomorrow morning, and that I look forward to a frank conversation." She held Connolly's gaze. "That's my answer. Give him exactly those words." Connolly looked at her for a long moment, looked at the letters, looked at the wall between them and the street where sound traveled. He left. The second man followed. Dora sat down hard in her chair. "Lord Almighty," she said. Elizabeth set the letters on the table. Her hands were shaking now, finally barely visible, the shaking that came after, rather than during the body's honest accounting of what had just happened. The front door of the store banged, and Martha came through, eyes wide, Denny behind her. "I heard from the front." "We're all right," Elizabeth said. "Denny." The boy looked at her. "Can you get a message to Wyatt Callahan tonight?" "Yes, ma'am," he said immediately. No hesitation, no weighing of consequences. Just yes, the way 14-year-olds said yes when they'd already decided which side they were on. "Tell him we have everything," she said. "Tell him we need 3 more days, and the witnesses need to be ready." She paused. "And tell him—" She stopped. Thought about what she wanted to say. Thought about what needed to be said versus what could wait for the saying in person. "Tell him 3 and 2, she said. "He'll know it means we're all right." Denny nodded and went. Martha locked the front door for the first time Elizabeth had ever heard of her locking it in the middle of a business day. She came into the back room and looked at the letters on the table, and at the two women, and at the particular quality of the air that held what had nearly happened and what had not. "The cellar," she said. "Tonight, all of us." "All of us," Elizabeth agreed. She picked up the letters, wrapped them back in Clara's oilskin with the same careful knot her sister had used as precisely as she could manage. Put them at the bottom of her valise beneath the journal, beneath the false bottom her father had built. 2 layers of her father's careful work, protecting her sister's brave work, waiting for a federal commissioner who was 3 days out and riding hard. 3 days. She could hold 3 days. She thought about Nathaniel Graves in his house reading the contents of Clara's recipe tin and realizing slowly, with the dawning fury of a man who had never before been outmaneuvered, that the dead woman had sent him in the wrong direction. She thought about how angry he was going to be. She thought about how that anger was going to make him careless. And she held that thought carefully, the way you held something that might be a weapon if you were patient enough to wait for the right moment to use it. 3 days was a long time to wait and a short time to survive. Elizabeth learned the difference between those two things in Martha Aldridge's cellar, where the 3 of them slept in shifts and listened to the sounds of a town that was learning 1 careful hour at a time. That something was changing in the valley, it had been afraid of for 15 years. The first day, Graves sent Sheriff Holt to the store with a written request. Formal, polite, the language of a reasonable man asking Elizabeth to come to the house at her earliest convenience to discuss the terms of their arrangement. Martha received it. Martha told Holt that Miss Harper was resting and would send word when she was available. Holt looked at Martha with the expression of a man who knew he was being managed and couldn't prove it. He left. The second day, Graves stopped being polite. Connolly came back this time with 3 men, and this time he didn't knock. He walked in through the unlocked front door. Martha had made a point of leaving it unlocked, because a locked door on a business in a small town said everything about what was happening inside it, and he moved through the store with the specific kind of purpose that announced itself as authority, borrowed from a man who wasn't present. Martha was behind the counter. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at difficult men for 30 years. "Mr. Connolly," she said, "I don't recall inviting you past the counter. I need to speak with Miss Harper." "Miss Harper isn't here." Connolly looked around the store, looked at the back room door, looked at Martha. "Mrs. Aldridge, I'd encourage you to think carefully about what you're doing. I'm running my store," Martha said. "Same as I've done for 26 years. What are you doing?" The silence stretched. One of the men behind Connolly shifted his weight. Connolly's jaw flexed. "Where is she?" he said. "I don't know," Martha said. "Perfectly even, perfectly calm. Women move around, Mr. Connolly. They don't always report their whereabouts." She held his gaze. "Is there something I can help you find in the store? I have new stock in from Denver. Very reasonable prices." He left. In the cellar, Elizabeth heard his boots on the floor above her and counted the footsteps and did not breathe until they stopped, and then started again going the other direction. Beside her, Dora had one hand pressed flat over her own mouth. Martha's rifle lay across Elizabeth's knees. That was the second day. On the morning of the third day, Wyatt came back. She heard his knock before she was fully awake. 3, pause 2, and she was up the cellar steps and at the back door in the dark before Martha had stirred. She opened it, and he was there, trail dusty and not quite rested, with Thomas Garrett behind him, and an expression on his face that meant he had things to tell her that were both better and worse than she was expecting. "Hargrove's a day out," he said, stepping inside. He pushed faster than he said he would. He got the wire, and he rode straight through. "1 day," Elizabeth said. The relief of it moved through her, and then immediately back out again, because 1 day was still a day. "Graves knows about the church." Wyatt went still. When, last night, Denny brought word one of Graves's men was seen asking the pastor questions about the pews, The pastor told him nothing, but he told Denny everything. She looked at him. He doesn't know I have the letters, but he knows Clara hid something in that church, and he knows it's gone now. He knows you took it. He knows someone took it. He'll work the rest out by morning. She paused. He's going to stop waiting, Wyatt. The polite version of this ends today. Garrett came forward. He looked thinner than he had 3 days ago, with the particular thinness that came from riding hard on fear's fuel. But his eyes were clear. The witnesses, he said. All 7. Wyatt found them all. She looked at Wyatt. 5 in the valley, 2 outside it. The 2 outside it gave written statements 2 days ago signed, witnessed by a man Hargrove sent ahead of him. He held her gaze. The 5 in the valley are ready. They'll present themselves when Hargrove arrives. A pause. Dora's husband is one of them. Elizabeth turned to look at Dora, who had come up from the cellar and was standing in the doorway to the back room. Dora nodded. It was the nod of a woman who had talked something over with someone she loved and come out the other side of it. Amos is ready, Dora said. He's been ready for a long time. He just needed to believe it would matter. Martha had the coffee on by then, because Martha always had the coffee on, and they sat around the back room table, in the early morning 5 people who had spent 3 days in varying degrees of danger and had not somehow come apart. And Wyatt spread out a rough map he'd drawn from memory, and they talked through what the next 24 hours needed to look like. Hargrove would arrive the following morning. He needed to be met outside of town before Graves knew he was coming, because if Graves had warning, he would do one of 2 things, run or escalate. Running meant he got away with enough to rebuild somewhere else. Escalating meant people got hurt. He won't run, Elizabeth said. His whole identity is this valley. He's spent 15 years making himself indispensable to it. He can't conceive of himself somewhere else starting over. She looked at the map. He'll escalate. Then we need Hargrove in town before Graves knows he's federal, Wyatt said. If he looks like a regular traveler coming through, Graves won't move against him openly. He'll have a badge, Garrett said. Not if he keeps his coat buttoned, Elizabeth said. Wyatt looked at her. You want a federal land commissioner to ride into this town undercover. I want him to have 10 minutes to read what I give him before Graves knows who he is, she said. 10 minutes. After that, he can show every badge he owns. Silence around the table. Then Garrett made a sound that was close to a laugh. Your sister, he said, negotiated the same way. Completely reasonable until the moment you realized what she'd just agreed to was completely unreasonable. Elizabeth did not smile. But she felt something warm move through the center of her chest that was the closest thing to it she'd managed in 3 days. They worked out the rest of it over 2 more cups of coffee and a plan that Wyatt kept calling dangerous and Elizabeth kept calling necessary until he stopped arguing the distinction. That afternoon, Graves made his move. Not through Connolly, not through Holt. He came himself, which was how she knew the patience had finally broken when a man like Nathaniel Graves stopped sending intermediaries and walked through a door himself. It meant the thing he was controlling was no longer controllable from a distance. He came to Martha's store at 2 in the afternoon, and he came alone, which was either a gesture of good faith or the performance of one, and Elizabeth was in the back room when Martha knocked twice on the connecting door in the signal they'd agreed on. She stood up. She straightened her dress. She looked at Wyatt. He was standing against the far wall with his arms crossed and the expression he wore when he was watching something he didn't like but had agreed to allow. He gave her a single nod. She went out to the front of the store. Graves was standing at the counter. He looked at her when she came through the door, and something moved in his face. Calculation, and underneath it, something raw. The expression of a man who had almost everything organized the way he wanted it, and was encountering for one of the only times in his life the experience of being unable to finish the organization. Elizabeth, he said. Mr. Graves. She came to the counter and stood across from him, did not offer her hand. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I think we've been playing a game that doesn't need to be played. I haven't been playing anything, she said. No. He acknowledged it with a slight incline of his head. No, I don't think you have. That's what I mean. He placed both hands flat on the counter, the same gesture she'd noticed others make when they needed something solid. I know you have something of Clara's. I know you've been in contact with people in this town who have reason to want to cause me difficulties. I know a wire was sent from the next county. He held her gaze. I know all of it, Elizabeth. I want you to understand that. All right, she said. What I'm offering you is a way out of this that doesn't end badly for anyone. He spoke with the measured calm of a man who had given this speech before in different forms. Whatever you have, whatever Clara collected in her time here, hand it over, go home to your mother, and I'll forgive the debt. All of it. Legitimately in writing filed with the county. Your family will owe me nothing. A pause. No one needs to get hurt. This can end quietly. She looked at him. At the careful face, the arranged reasonableness, the man who had built a cage around a valley and called it community leadership. My sister got hurt quietly, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt. Not quite. Something closer to irritation at the inconvenience of the fact. Clara's death was— I know what Clara's death was, Elizabeth said. Her voice stayed even. It cost her everything she had to keep it even. And I know you know I know. So let's not use the word illness in this conversation, Mr. Graves. We're past that. A silence fell that had the quality of a door closing. He looked at her for a long moment. The arranged reasonableness was gone from his face now. What replaced it was not anger, not yet, but the foundation of it, the cold certainty of a man who had decided that one path was closing and another needed to open. You're making a mistake, he said. I've made them before, she said. I recover. He picked up his hands from the counter, straightened, looked at her with the specific quality of attention that meant he was memorizing something. Tomorrow, he said. Whatever you're planning, whatever you think is coming, I want you to remember this conversation. I want you to remember that I offered you a way out. I'll remember it, she said. He left. She went back into the room and sat down, and her legs were not entirely reliable beneath her. Wyatt was already there, right there, and he didn't say anything, just stood close enough that she could feel the solid fact of him beside her. He's going to move tonight, she said. Yes, Wyatt said. Not against me, against the witnesses. She looked up at him. He doesn't know which ones, but he'll go after the most likely. Amos Riley, Wyatt said. And Garrett, she said. He already knows about Garrett. Wyatt was already moving toward the door. I'll get to them. Wyatt. He stopped. She looked at him. Be careful. He looked back at her with that expression she'd been collecting without meaning to the one that didn't have a name yet. The one that lived in the space between what was happening right now and what came after. Always am, he said. You really aren't, she said. You rode down a ridge at two strangers to stop them taking my bag. That's not careful. He almost smiled. That was practical, he said. Careful and practical are different conversations. He held her gaze for one more moment. Lock the cellar door. He went. She locked the cellar door. That night was the longest of the three, and she spent most of it awake, listening to the town's sounds and separating them into the sounds that meant nothing and the sounds that meant something, a skill she'd developed without noticing over 3 days of needing it. Martha slept in the chair by the door, with the rifle across her lap. Dora slept fitfully on the cot in the corner. Elizabeth sat at the table with Clara's letters in front of her and read them again, not for information this time, but for the other thing, for the sister in the words, for the voice she would not hear again, for the presence of someone who had loved her and been brave and left her this work to finish. At some point near dawn she heard horses, more than one, moving at speed on the main street heading east. She went to the small window that was at ground level, the cellar's eye on the world, and she couldn't see who they were. Only the legs of horses going past, and she pressed her hand flat against the wall and counted them. 5 horses. Heading east, toward the Riley place. She was at the cellar steps and up through the door and across the back room, and she had the back door open before she'd fully decided what she was going to do, and then she stopped herself, hand on the door frame, breathing. Wyatt was already there. He'd said he was going to get to them. She had to trust that. Trusting it was the hardest thing she'd done in 3 days, which was saying something. She went back to the table, sat down, picked up Clara's letters. She waited. When the knock came, it was not 3 and 2. It was a single knock, hard and quick, and then Denny's voice. "Miss Harper, it's Denny, please." And she had the door open in a second. He was out of breath. He'd been running. "Mr. Callahan got there first," he said, and she felt the relief so sharply it was almost painful. "He had the Riley family out before Graves's men arrived. They're at the Morrison Ranch. Mr. Morrison said they could stay, said he's been waiting for a reason to stop being quiet about things." He caught his breath. "Garrett's there too. Mr. Callahan got him out 2 hours ago." "Is anyone hurt?" "No, ma'am. Graves's men went to an empty house." He paused. They weren't happy about it. Martha made a sound from the doorway that was entirely satisfying. "Denny," Elizabeth said. "Where is Wyatt now?" "Coming back. He said to tell you." The boy reached into his pocket and brought out a folded piece of paper. She opened it. 3 words, familiar. "They're safe. Morning." She folded it, put it against her chest for a moment, her eyes closed. "Thank you, Denny," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and she thought she heard pride in his 14-year-old voice, the pride of someone who had been trusted with something that mattered and had not dropped it. Morning came. Hargrove arrived at 9 o'clock, which was earlier than expected, which meant he'd ridden through the night on the strength of a telegraph wire that had told him the situation had accelerated. He was not what Elizabeth had pictured. He was perhaps 45, compact and quiet, with the weathered look of a man who had spent most of his career in the field rather than behind a desk, and eyes that assessed everything and showed nothing, which was a quality she recognized and respected. He came into Martha's store with his coat buttoned, introduced himself with his name and no title, and looked at the assembled group. Elizabeth, Wyatt, Garrett, Martha, Dora. Denny standing in this corner trying to look like furniture, with the expression of a man who was calibrating. "You're the Harper woman," he said to Elizabeth. "I am." "You have the Graves correspondence." "I have the journal, the land records with Garrett's annotations, written statements from 2 out-of-county witnesses, and 12 letters between Nathaniel Graves and 3 men in positions of territorial and county authority spanning 8 years. She held his gaze. "My sister collected most of it before she died. I found the letters 3 days ago in the hiding place she left me directions to." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "Your sister," he said. Not a question, but not nothing either. He said it with the particular respect of someone who understood what it cost. "Clara Harper," she said. 22 years old. She died in Graves's house 8 weeks ago. He called it illness. "I know the name," he said, quietly. "I've known the name since the original wire." He looked at Wyatt. "You're Callahan." "Yes." "You sent the wire?" "Yes." Hargrove looked at the table. "Put it all out," he said. "Everything. I need to see it." She put it all out. He read in silence for 40 minutes. No one in the room spoke. Martha refilled his coffee without being asked, and he drank it without looking up. At one point, he set down a letter and picked up the journal and read 3 pages and set it down and picked the letter back up and read it again. And Elizabeth watched his face and saw the shape of what he was building in his mind, the same shape she'd built the structure of something that went higher and wider than one corrupt man in one valley. Finally, he looked up. "I need all 7 witnesses," he said. "They're at the Morrison Ranch," Wyatt said. "Ready." "I need Sheriff Holt removed from his position before he can warn Graves that I'm here. That requires a federal order which I have authority to issue, but I need it served before—" "Holt is at the saloon on Tuesday mornings," Martha said. "Has been for 15 years. He won't be expecting anything on a Tuesday morning." Hargrove looked at her. "You know his schedule. I know everyone's schedule, Martha said. I've been watching this town for 30 years. Something almost like a smile moved across Hargrove's face and disappeared. We move in an hour, he said. He looked at Elizabeth. I want you there. I know, she said. Not behind me, beside me. When Graves sees you standing in the open in front of witnesses, it does something to his calculus. He's spent 3 days trying to isolate you. You walking into his house with a federal commissioner destroys the story he's been telling himself about how this ends. Wyatt said, She's been in his house once already. I know, Hargrove said. That's why I want her there again. Same woman, different circumstances. She looked at Wyatt. He was looking at Hargrove with the expression of a man who found the logic sound and the prospect unpleasant, which were two separate things he was managing simultaneously. I'll be there, she said. The hour moved fast and slow at the same time the way hours did when you were waiting for something to start. Hargrove dispatched 2 men he'd brought with him to the Morrison Ranch to bring the witnesses in quietly coming through the East Road rather than the main street. He sent a 3rd man to handle Sheriff Holt in the manner Martha had suggested, which went as smoothly as 30 years of schedule watching could make it. Holt was at the saloon surprised, and was in federal custody before he'd finished his first drink. Garrett came in from the ranch looking steadier than he had in 3 days, and he looked at the table full of evidence with the expression of a man who had carried a weight for 2 years and could finally feel the ground coming up to meet it. Amos Riley's outside, he said. He wants to speak with you. Elizabeth went out. Amos Riley was a man of perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with the hands of someone who had farmed hard land and the eyes of someone who had been ashamed of something for a long time. He took his hat off when she approached. He held it in front of him with both hands. Miss Harper, he said. I knew your sister a little. She was kind to my wife. He paused. I've been a coward for 2 years. I want you to know I know that. Mr. Riley, I want you to know I know that, he said again quietly but firmly. Because she didn't deserve what happened to her, and part of the reason it could happen was that people like me stayed quiet. He held her gaze. I'm not staying quiet today. I wanted you to hear that from me directly. She looked at him, at the hat in his hands, at the shame and the resolve living in the same face. Thank you, she said. That's all I needed to hear. He nodded, put his hat back on, went back toward the group with the particular straightness of a man who had said the thing that needed saying. Wyatt appeared at her shoulder. Ready, he said. In a minute. She turned to face him. They were standing outside Martha's back door, the late morning, pressing its heat down on everything, the sounds of the town going on around them, in the way towns went on, even when the thing that held them in place was about to shift. She looked at him, at the mountain cowboy who had ridden down a ridge for a woman he didn't know because it didn't seem right not to. After this is over, she said. He looked at her carefully. After Hargrove does what he's here to do, and the witnesses give their testimony, and this valley starts becoming something different than what it's been. She stopped, started again. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't have a plan for that part. No, he said. What do you do? She said. After. When the thing you came down off the mountain to do is done. He was quiet for a moment. Then, haven't thought about it that much. Haven't you? Been fairly occupied, he said. 3 days is a lot of occupation. Wyatt. He looked at her with the expression she didn't have a name for the one she'd been collecting, the one that lived in the space between this moment and whatever came after it. I go back to the mountain, he said. Generally. That's what I do. He paused. Although the mountain's been a quieter reason to go back to than it used to be. She understood that. She understood what he was saying beneath what he was saying. She'd been doing the same thing, saying things that meant more than they appeared to mean for 3 days, and apparently she recognized the habit when she encountered it. I've never lived on a mountain, she said. It's quiet, he said. Mostly. I don't need quiet, she said. I need... She thought about what she needed. about what the last 3 days had shown her she needed. I need to be somewhere I chose, something I built, not something I was sent to. She held his gaze. Clara chose that. She chose to be here, even knowing what she knew. She chose it because it mattered. She paused. I want to choose something because it matters. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. The Morrison spread has a parcel on the eastern ridge they've been trying to sell for 2 years, he said. Good land, runs along the creek. Morrison's a decent man. He'll deal fairly. A pause. I know how to build on a ridge. Spent 11 years learning. She looked at him. That's not an answer to what I said, she said. No, he said. It's something adjacent to an answer. He held her gaze with the steadiness that was just him. That was just the quality he had. The quality she'd trusted on a road when she had no reason to trust anyone. The adjacent to answer version is, I'd like it if you stayed. In the valley. Whatever that looks like. He said it simply the way he said everything that was true. The rest of it, we'd figure out as it came. She felt the fracturing in her chest again, that small, clean break, the thing that had been held too tightly finally releasing. All right, she said. He nodded, like she'd confirmed something he'd been fairly sure of, but wanted to hear directly. They went in. It took all of 7 minutes to walk from Martha's store to Nathaniel Graves's front gate, and in those 7 minutes, Hargrove fell into step on Elizabeth's left. Wyatt on her right, and behind them, Garrett and the witnesses, and Martha Aldridge, with her apron still on, because she hadn't thought to take it off and hadn't wanted to take the time. Graves was on his porch when they came through the gate. He saw Hargrove first, took in the federal commissioner, without knowing that's what he was looking at. Then his eyes went to Elizabeth, then to Wyatt, then to the people behind them, to Garrett, who had disappeared 3 days ago, and was now standing in his front yard, and to Amos Riley, with his hat in his hands, and to the widow Pierce, and 3 other faces he recognized as people who had signed things, who had witnessed things, who had kept quiet for years, and were standing in his yard in the late morning sun, not keeping quiet anymore. The performance broke. She watched it happen. Watched the arranged face, the careful face, the face of the legitimate man. Watched it all. Simply stop working, the way a machine stopped when something essential gave way inside it. What was underneath was not what she'd expected. She'd expected rage. She'd expected the cold fury of a man who'd been cornered. What she saw was smaller than that. What she saw was a man who had spent 15 years believing he was the most powerful thing in the valley and was encountering for the first time the experience of being wrong about it. Hargrove stepped forward, unbuttoned his coat, showed the badge. Nathaniel Graves, he said. I'm Federal Land Commissioner David Hargrove. I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of land fraud, document falsification, conspiracy with public officials, and related offenses under territorial law. He paused. I'm also carrying federal charges against Judge Alderman and 2 members of the Territorial Government Office, whose names I believe you'll recognize. Another pause. You have the right to come with me quietly, or you can make this more complicated than it needs to be. I'd advise against the latter. Graves looked at Elizabeth. She held his gaze. She did not look away. She wrote to you, he said. Not Hargrove, not the warrant. Her. Like the collapse of 15 years of constructed power came down to this one sentence. Clara wrote to you. She did, Elizabeth said. She told me not to come. He absorbed that. But you came. I came, she said. A silence that had the weight of everything in it. She was smart, he said. His voice had gone somewhere odd, somewhere almost quiet, like he was saying something real for the first time, and the realness of it was uncomfortable in his own mouth. Smarter than I thought. She was the smartest person I've ever known, Elizabeth said. And she's the reason every person standing in your yard right now is standing there. Graves looked at the people behind her, at Garrett, at the witnesses, at Martha with her apron, at Wyatt Callahan, who had come down off his mountain 11 years ago and stayed and lived by a simple law. A man's worth ain't measured by what he owns, but by what he protects, and had ridden down a ridge for a woman he didn't know, and had not once looked away from what needed doing. Graves said nothing else. He put his hands out. Hargrove's men came forward. Elizabeth watched them take him through his own gate, and she felt the thing she hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief, not even the clean satisfaction of a finished thing. She felt grief. For Clara, who should have been standing here. Who should have been the one to watch this? Who had done most of the work of making this moment possible and had not lived to see it. She felt Wyatt's hand beside hers, not taking it, just there. Close enough that the backs of their hands were almost touching the warmth of him, present and steady. She turned her palm over. He took her hand. They stood like that while Hargrove's men walked Nathaniel Graves through the gate of his own property. And the witnesses of Black Ridge Valley stood in the late morning and watched the thing they'd been afraid of for 15 years finally move away from them. Garrett made a sound beside her. She looked at him. There were tears on his face that he made no effort to conceal. "She'd have had something to say about this," he said. "Clara. She'd have had exactly the right thing to say." "She did," Elizabeth said. "She said it in October. She said it in November and December. She said it in every letter she wrote me." She looked at the gate, at the empty porch, at the valley that was already in ways you couldn't see yet, but could feel starting to shift into a different shape. She said, "Tell the truth." She said, "Be brave." She said, "It matters." She squeezed Wyatt's hand. She was right, she said, about all of it. 1 year later, the land on the eastern ridge of Black Ridge Valley had a small ranch on it, built on the high ground where the creek ran, and the mornings came first before they reached the valley below. It was not a large ranch. It was a chosen one. Every beam of it measured and placed by a man who had spent 11 years learning how to build things that lasted on difficult ground, and a woman who had come here in a wagon with a dead sister's letter against her ribs and had turned out to be exactly who that sister said she was. Martha Aldridge attended the small ceremony in September with her apron on. Thomas Garrett stood as witness. Amos Riley brought his wife and his cousin and arrived an hour early. Denny, 15 now, with the self-possession of a boy who had decided who he was going to be and had some evidence in favor of the decision, stood at the edge of the gathering and looked like he was trying not to grin and failing. Hargrove's investigation had taken the better part of the year. Judge Alderman resigned in February. The 2 territorial officials were removed in March. The land transfers were reviewed, and where review showed fraud, the land came back to the people it had been taken from. Not all of them. Not easily. Not without the kind of legal grinding that took months and cost more than money. But it happened. It happened because 7 witnesses had stood up in a valley they'd been afraid of for 15 years, and because a federal commissioner had read 12 letters and a journal full of names and numbers and understood what he was looking at, and because a 22-year-old woman had hidden the truth in a church pew and sent her sister a recipe for minor stew that was never about stew at all. On the morning after the ceremony, Elizabeth stood outside the ranch house in the early light, the kind of light that came before the heat, the kind that was honest about what it illuminated. She could see the valley below. She could see Martha's store from here, and the church roof, and the road she'd come in on, that baked dirt road with the wagon ruts, and the 2 riders who'd thought she was something manageable. Wyatt came out behind her. He stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment, watching the valley the way you watched something you'd helped build. Not owned, not controlled, but helped toward what it was trying to be. "You're thinking about Clara," he said. He knew her well enough now to know when she was quiet and when she was there. "Yes," she said. "I do that most mornings." "That's all right," he said. "I know." She looked at the church roof, at the small cross on top that she could just see from here. "I think she'd be glad," she said, "that it's the valley, that it's here, that it didn't just scatter, that there's something standing that came from what she did." She paused. "I think she'd be glad it's this." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She'd be glad it's you." Elizabeth looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression she had a name for now. She'd found the name for it somewhere around the 3rd week, sitting at breakfast, watching him be careful with something small. A mug, a window latch, the wing of a bird he'd found injured in the pasture, the way he was careful with everything he'd decided to protect. The name for the expression was simply here. It was the look of a man who was entirely here, who had chosen to be here, who was not planning to be anywhere else. She turned back to the valley. "So would I," she said. The sun came up full over the ridge, and the valley went golden below them, and the ranch stood on its chosen ground, and the life they were building, not rescued into, not arranged toward, but walked into together with open eyes and decided hearts stretched out ahead of them, like land that had always been worth fighting for. It had always been worth fighting for. Clara had known that first. The rest of them had simply caught up.